Network firewall. This is a device that protects your network from outside. It protects from outside attacks, from some penetration, etc., etc. And if you buy a new firewall, just unpack it, just plug it and turn it on, all ports, all traffic is blocked by default. All traffic in this device or in the software is blocked by default. And every router, actually every router has built-in firewall as well. For instance, if we take some TP-Link router, home router, or Zixel router, okay, Zixel router, there are cheap routers, right? So even cheapest routers have built-in firewall functions. So why we need this firewall? We need this firewall to protect our network. And there are software and hardware firewalls. So about hardware firewalls, as I mentioned before, every simple home or small office router has built-in firewall options. And of course we have real firewalls. We can buy additional firewalls to our office. We can have a router, some router which is connected to the internet, and we can install the firewall between the router and our internal network. This is a firewall and this is our internal network. This is our switch and everything is connected to the switch, something like that. Or we can use vice versa. We can install a firewall and connect it to the internet and install a router here. It's also possible, and connect our router to our switch. It's also possible. But most of the time we have one device which is firewall and router at the same time. For example, as I mentioned before, TP-Link, Zixel router, home routers. This is one device, right? This is one device with wireless antennas here. We connect this device to the internet, and this device, there is option, firewall option. If you configure this device, you can notice that there is an option called firewall, but we cannot compare this option, the firewall options in this simplest device with the real hardware firewall, because real hardware firewall has a lot of more options than this simplest, cheapest router. But anyway, for home or for small office, it will do fine. Anyway, we have here two devices in one device, firewall and router, but it's mostly router than firewall. But here, this device is mostly firewall than router. So we can connect this device to our switch, and it's fine. It's working fine. Or we can buy this device, buy a big firewall, and this firewall has a router option as well, and connect this to the internet and to the switch. It's mostly firewall and additionally router. So we have here four configurations, as you can see. First configuration, this one, router with firewall on the one device connected to the internet and to the network. Firewall connected to the internet, and one side of this firewall is connected to the internal network. Here we have firewall and router, but please note that these devices, we need to spend more money for this. We have to buy this firewall and additional router here. And this scenario, router connected to the internet, firewall is behind the router. In this scenario, router is behind the firewall, but in this scenario, firewall is behind the router. So we can connect these devices with different ways. But mostly we have one device which includes firewall and router. If we are mid-sized, if we are in a mid-sized office or big office, mostly we use two devices. Firewall, like this one, expensive firewall, and router, or just one firewall, but just like this hardware firewall, real expensive firewall with router options on it. But for home or small offices, we often use small, simple routers which includes firewall options. So as we know, there are hardware firewalls and software firewalls. What we do with software firewalls? For example, IPCOP, PFSense, carrier firewalls. In this case, we don't buy a hardware. For instance, if we have a small, cheapest Zixel router, which also have firewall options as I mentioned before, but it's not enough for us because we have to configure a lot of options, but this router and firewall option in this router doesn't support it. Okay, we have two options. Either we can buy real hardware firewall and connect to this router, but in this case we most probably will pay a lot of money because the hardware firewall is more expensive. It's expensive than software firewall. Of course, it depends on the version of software firewall, but in most cases hardware firewall is more expensive than software firewalls. But they're of course better. They're better, that's why they're expensive. But if our small office is not big and it's yet we don't need more security, we don't need an expensive hardware firewall. In this case, we can use just software firewall. What do we do for this? We just take any desktop computer or some server or any computer, install one of these firewalls here, software firewalls, buy license for this, of course, pay for license, and configure these firewalls, software firewalls, on this device, on this computer. Connect this computer to the router, and this interface of computer connect to the switch. Or we can use we can configure this firewall, the software firewall here in this computer. Or most of the times we don't even use this router. We use just software firewall, connect external interface LAN card to the internet cable, and that's all. We just use one device, some desktop for firewall features. What firewall does besides the blocking all the traffic? Okay, because it's good that the firewall blocks all the traffic, but we need internet. So it can provide internet connection for us. It can provide port forwarding for us. What port forwarding or port mapping? What does it mean? For instance, if we have an office, and in the office, this is our firewall, right? In the office we have surveillance cameras, a lot of surveillance cameras, and we need to connect to these cameras from the home or from the street, from the outside of our office, and be able to watch the cameras, what's happening here in the office or somewhere. We need to access these cameras, and these cameras are connected, or they are IP cameras, or they're connected to the NVR, right? NVR, or to the DVR. If they're analog cameras, they're connected to the DVR. And these devices, NVR or DVR, have network interface, LAN interface connected to the switch, right? Here is a switch, and this device is connected to the network. And each of these devices have their own IP address. For instance, IP address of this device is 1, 1, 1, 1. Of this device is 2, 2, 2, 2. And by default, as you know, firewall blocks everything from outside. And also I want to mention, these NVRs have special ports to connect to them. Special port. Every device has special ports. Every application. But if we are going to use our smartphone to connect to our this firewall is connected to the switch. If we are going to use our smartphone to connect to our office in order to watch the cameras, we'll need application, right? And every application uses specific port. So in the NVR or DVR settings, you can notice any port number, for instance port 100. Okay, and also, in order to connect to our office, in most of the cases we should have statical IP address from our provider. As you know, there are two types of address: dynamical and statical IP address. Statical IP address doesn't change, and we always have this IP address. For instance, our external IP address is 3333. Okay, we should have this IP address most of the time. Okay, now what should we do? We need to enable to create port forwarding in our firewall. So what should we'll create any rule, port forwarding rule. What should we include in this rule? In this rule we should include source IP address. We need to include information here. We will creating a rule that allow any special connection from outside. So we need to include source IP address. We can include any, for instance, any IP address. We allow any source IP address, it doesn't matter. We include destination IP address. Destination IP address in this case, if we are enabling connection to our NVR, which IP address is 1111, we are putting this IP address. Source IP, any IP address, destination IP address 1111. Okay, source port, which port we'll use? Any port, for instance, any. And the main thing, destination port. So this port 100, we should know the destination port. If we put a wrong port number, the system will not work, and I will not be able to connect to the surveillance cameras. So I should put this port number, destination port number, and allow. Yes, allow. I'm allowing any connection from outside using these parameters, from any IP address to this exact IP address, from any port to this exact port. And in this case, when I'll configure my application from my phone, I'll put external IP address, this one, and port number, this one, 100, username to connect to the NVR DVR, and password. And I will be able to connect to my NVR to see my surveillance cameras. The same thing I can do with any server in this office. For instance, I can use any web server which uses port 80 here, right? I have web server. I need access to this web server from outside, from anywhere. So in this case, I also create port forwarding rule, allow access from any, and this web server's IP address is, for instance, 4444, right? So I'm creating port forwarding from any IP address to the IP address 4444 from any port, or port 80, and destination port 80, for instance. And when I tap this IP address from my Chrome, for instance, browser, I open Chrome browser and typing this IP address, the system automatically forwards me to this web server and displays the page on this web server. So we can do a lot of things with our firewalls. Also, we can do web filter, the main feature here, web filtering. For instance, we can block some specific websites, so users will not be able to reach some websites, or we can block specific websites for specific people, or we can manage bandwidth, I mean speed of the internet. For some departments the speed will be 10 megabits per second, for some departments 5 megabits, etc., etc. Or we can block audio streaming, or we can block video streaming, etc., etc. So we can do a lot of things with web filtering. We can create reports. daily reports, weekly or monthly reports, and send this report to the management so they can see who during this month who accessed which sites, how many times they spend on on this website. For example, maybe some person is using the Facebook most time of the day, probably, etc., etc. So it depends on you. It depends on the size of your company. It depends on the it depends on the money you can spend. Either you can buy a small simple router with two antennas by being informed that this router, this simple cheapest routers have the options port forwarding. Most of them have this options port forwarding, but they don't have web filter options. Most of them don't have these options. So for web filter we usually use software firewalls or the hardware firewalls like in the picture above. That's it. Thanks for watching.